When people think about missionaries, they often picture selfless figures traveling across the world to spread kindness, build schools, and offer aid. But the deeper you look into the history of missionary work, the more disturbing the picture becomes. What has often been presented as charity was, in many cases, a tool of domination. Missionaries did not simply bring a religion, they brought a cultural system that reshaped societies, dismantled traditions, and erased identities. Behind the smiling faces of missionaries was a project designed to expand influence and control. The spread of Christianity across continents was rarely peaceful. Missionaries arrived alongside soldiers, colonists, and merchants. The religious mission was often inseparable from the political one. Converting populations was not only about saving souls, but also about making communities more obedient to colonial powers. In Africa, Asia, and the Americas, missionaries translated the Bible into local languages, but they also translated local cultures into something that aligned with European values. When children were taught to read Scripture, they were also taught to reject the traditions of their parents. The work of missionaries cannot be separated from the destruction of indigenous cultures. In North America, Christian missions worked hand in hand with policies that forced Native American children into boarding schools. The stated purpose was to civilize them, but the reality was cultural erasure. Children were stripped of their languages, their clothing, and their names. Punishments for speaking their mother tongue were severe. Generations lost the ability to pass down stories, songs, and traditions because missionaries declared them pagan. What was called education was in truth a method of breaking cultural continuity. Missionary projects were justified with the language of love and salvation, but beneath that was a clear hierarchy. European Christianity was presented as the ultimate truth, while indigenous knowledge was dismissed as superstition. Entire systems of medicine, philosophy, and spirituality were declared worthless simply because they did not fit into a biblical framework. Even agricultural practices, diets, and marriage customs were reshaped to mimic European ways. This was not charity. It was social engineering disguised as faith. In Africa, missionary work was central to colonial expansion. European powers wanted control over land and resources, but they also needed control over people. Missionaries often acted as cultural pioneers, softening resistance before colonial authorities moved in. They convinced local populations that accepting Christianity was a path to progress, while in reality, it was a path to dependence. Traditional authority structures were undermined, and those who converted were often given positions of privilege, dividing communities against themselves. One of the most damaging effects of missionary work was the linkage forged between religion and shame. Practices that had been natural for centuries were suddenly labeled sinful. Clothing, rituals, and family structures were policed under the banner of morality. In places like Polynesia, missionaries condemned dances, chants, and artistic expressions that had deep cultural meaning. What had been communal and sacred became forbidden. Entire generations grew up believing their ancestors had lived in darkness, even though those ancestors had sustained flourishing societies long before missionaries arrived. Missionaries also played a major role in justifying slavery and exploitation. While some missionaries spoke against extreme abuses, many others preached obedience and submission. Passages from the Bible were used to convince enslaved people that their suffering was divinely ordained. Mission schools often trained local converts to be compliant workers rather than independent leaders. The rhetoric of salvation became a tool to keep people docile under systems of exploitation. Even where missionaries claimed to oppose colonial violence, their presence reinforced the system. By teaching that ultimate truth came from Christianity, they paved the way for foreign domination to seem natural. When people abandoned their own traditions, they became more dependent on European models of authority. A society that once relied on its elders, its healers, and its storytellers now relied on pastors and missionaries. And those pastors often looked to European churches for guidance. In Asia, missionary activity was deeply tied to the weakening of traditional institutions. In India, missionaries pushed not only for conversions, but also for laws that aligned with Christian values. The suppression of local customs, like certain marriage practices, was framed as humanitarian reform. But these reforms were not neutral. They prioritized one worldview while undermining others. Entire communities were forced to redefine themselves according to values imposed from outside. What seemed like moral progress was, in fact, a form of cultural colonization. The missionary project also exploited moments of crisis. Famines, epidemics, and wars were often used as opportunities for conversion. Food, medicine, and shelter were distributed, but often with strings attached. Vulnerable people were told that salvation came through baptism. In times of desperation, faith was traded like currency. Those who refused conversion sometimes found themselves excluded from aid. The idea of unconditional love was weaponized as a bargaining tool. It is also important to see how missionary work shaped global inequalities that persist today. The map of Christian expansion often mirrors the map of colonial conquest. Wealth flowed out of colonized lands, while belief systems were replaced with doctrines that justified European dominance. Even after the end of direct colonial rule, the presence of missionary-founded institutions, schools, hospitals, and churches continued to influence how societies viewed themselves. These institutions were not neutral. They carried with them assumptions about what was civilized, what was primitive, and what was worthy of respect. The narrative that missionaries brought education to the world ignores what was lost in the process. Yes, they built schools, but those schools often excluded local traditions of knowledge. Oral histories, ecological wisdom, and indigenous philosophies were dismissed as irrelevant. The education system trained people to look outward for authority rather than inward to their own heritage. What looked like empowerment was often disempowerment in disguise. The damage caused by missionary work is still visible today. Many indigenous languages are endangered or extinct, largely because missionary schools punished children for speaking them. Communities continue to struggle with fractured identities, caught between traditions that were condemned and religions that were imposed. The internalized shame planted by missionaries has not disappeared. It lingers in the way people view their past, their families, and even themselves. And yet, the official story of missionary work remains sanitized. Missionaries are remembered in textbooks as heroes who built clinics and taught literacy. Rarely do we hear about the children who cried themselves to sleep in boarding schools, forbidden from speaking to their siblings in their native tongue. Rarely do we hear about the rituals erased, the elders humiliated, or the generations made to feel that their ancestors were unworthy of respect. The narrative of charity hides a deeper reality of domination. The story of missionary work in the Congo reveals how religion and colonial exploitation were bound together. When King Leopold of Belgium claimed the Congo as his personal possession in the late 19th century, missionaries were among the first Europeans to settle there. They preached the gospel, built mission stations, and translated scripture, but they also helped justify Leopold's brutal rule. Reports of atrocities reached Europe, villages destroyed, forced labor imposed, hands cut off as punishment. But missionaries often softened the image of colonialism. They framed their work as humanitarian, even while the system they operated within was one of mass exploitation. The image of bringing light to a dark land concealed the reality of extracting rubber and ivory through unimaginable violence. In Hawaii, missionaries from New England arrived with the intention of saving souls, but their efforts went far beyond religion. They brought strict moral codes that condemned traditional Hawaiian practices, including clothing, dancing, and communal rituals. Over time, they gained influence in local politics, setting the stage for the eventual overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and annexation by the United States. What began as preaching ended with the dismantling of sovereignty. The sacred traditions of hula, chants, and indigenous spirituality were dismissed as sinful, and entire generations grew up alienated from their cultural roots. The loss was not just spiritual, it was political and economic as well. In Latin America, the earliest waves of missionary work went hand in hand with conquest. Spanish and Portuguese missionaries followed soldiers into new territories, baptizing entire populations at once, often under threat. Temples were demolished and replaced with churches. The sacred symbols of local religions were burned or melted down, sometimes literally recast into Christian icons. This was not a process of peaceful persuasion. It was forced replacement. A society could not keep its gods and add Christ alongside them. It had to abandon them or risk punishment. Even today, many Latin American festivals contain traces of pre-Christian traditions hidden under Catholic rituals, a sign of how communities resisted erasure by disguising their old customs within new forms. Missionaries were also deeply entangled in the system of racial hierarchy. They preached equality in the eyes of God, but practiced segregation in daily life. Converts were rarely treated as equals. European missionaries often maintained separate spaces, diets, and standards of living. The message was clear. Salvation did not erase racial hierarchy. Christianity offered spiritual inclusion, but reinforced social exclusion. This contradiction shaped entire societies, leaving behind divisions that lasted long after colonial authorities left. The way missionaries used education also deserves scrutiny. In many regions, mission schools were the only option for formal learning, but the curriculum was designed to produce compliance rather than critical thought. Lessons emphasized memorization of scripture, submission to authority, and rejection of local customs. Students learned to equate advancement with abandoning their heritage. In places like East Africa, some of the earliest African intellectuals were products of mission schools, but their education came at the cost of cultural alienation. They could write essays in English or French, but often could not write fluently in their own native languages, because literacy in those tongues was not valued. A recurring theme in missionary history is the way suffering was reframed as a path to salvation. Entire populations who endured disease, displacement, and forced labor were told that their trials brought them closer to God. This religious interpretation of suffering functioned as a kind of social control. Instead of asking why their lands were taken or why their children were punished, people were encouraged to see their pain as meaningful under Christian doctrine. Theologies that glorified suffering were convenient for those who benefited from colonial exploitation. In Australia, missionaries targeted Aboriginal peoples with the same pattern of cultural suppression. Indigenous children were taken from their families under the belief that they would be better off raised in Christian households. This created the so-called stolen generations. Many of those children grew up disconnected from their families and unable to reclaim their heritage. Missionaries spoke about saving them, but the reality was the breaking of bonds that had sustained Aboriginal communities for tens of thousands of years. Instead of preserving identity, missionary work erased it. The dark history also includes the way missionaries weaponized gender roles. In many societies, women held important spiritual or communal roles prior to conversion. Missionaries introduced patriarchal systems that pushed women into subordinate positions. Practices that gave women authority were dismissed as pagan. The introduction of Christian family models restricted female autonomy and reshaped entire societies along more rigid gender lines. What was presented as moral order was, in fact, a loss of social balance that had existed before. Even the act of translating scripture carried consequences. Missionaries presented themselves as defenders of local languages by creating written forms of them, but this was selective. They preserved languages only insofar as they served the spread of Christianity. What was considered worth writing down was not the community's myths, medicine, or philosophy, but the Bible. Local wisdom was often left unrecorded, while religious texts were mass-printed. The result was that future generations inherited a record saturated with Christian influence, while their own traditions survived only in fragmented form. Some missionaries argued they were fighting against injustices, such as slavery or cruel practices within societies. But these interventions were not neutral. They often framed themselves as rescuers, while ignoring the fact that their very presence was part of a larger system of domination. They sought to replace one form of harm with another, dismantling existing structures while replacing them with Christian norms that carried their own forms of control. The question was never whether people had the right to self-determination, but which external authority would shape them. In the 20th century, missionary work did not disappear. It adapted. With the end of colonial rule, missionaries shifted their focus to development projects. They built hospitals, schools, and aid programs. But the old pattern continued. Material help was tied to conversion. A family might receive medical care, but alongside it came pressure to adopt Christian practices. International aid organizations with missionary roots blurred the line between humanitarian work and evangelism. The message remained the same. Your traditions are inadequate, and your future depends on accepting our beliefs. Even today, missionary work in parts of Africa and Asia is presented as charity, but often functions as cultural dominance. Western missionaries arrive with resources that local communities cannot match. They distribute food and supplies, but the underlying goal remains conversion. In some cases, missionary groups openly exploit poverty, targeting the most vulnerable. The promise of scholarships, jobs, or sponsorships is used as leverage to encourage baptism. The power imbalance is undeniable. One side holds the resources, and the other side is asked to surrender its cultural identity in exchange. The legacy of missionary work can be measured in statistics about religious demographics, but it is also visible in psychological scars. The internal conflict between ancestral traditions and imposed beliefs has created identity struggles that persist for generations. People raised in missionary schools often grow up believing their culture was inferior, only to later realize the loss was orchestrated. Reconciliation with heritage becomes difficult because the break was deliberate and deep. Communities are left fragmented, and recovering what was destroyed is often impossible. The myth of missionary benevolence is maintained by highlighting only the visible infrastructure left behind: schools, hospitals, and churches. But behind every building stands the untold stories of what was erased to make room for it. When you measure the cost, you see that the price was not just material, but existential. Societies lost languages, spiritual systems, and entire worldviews. What was called salvation was, in fact, the systematic dismantling of human diversity. Missionary activity was not just about religion, it reshaped geopolitics. By converting sections of local populations, missionaries often created deep divisions within societies. Those who converted were rewarded with better opportunities, access to education, and sometimes political influence. Those who resisted were marginalized, portrayed as stubborn or backward. This split communities into two groups: the compliant and the resistant. These divisions outlasted colonial rule, creating internal conflicts that still affect nations today. In Rwanda, missionary education played a direct role in reinforcing ethnic categories that later exploded into violence. Missionaries favored certain groups over others, offering education and leadership roles selectively. This helped crystallize divisions that had previously been more fluid. By labeling some groups as more civilized or more suited for leadership, they sowed seeds of resentment that contributed to one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. The missionary project was not just about belief, it was about reshaping social order according to imported hierarchies. In many places, missionaries helped establish written records of local populations, but these records were framed through European eyes. Census data, tribal classifications, and linguistic divisions were often created or exaggerated by missionaries trying to organize communities for conversion. Once written down, these artificial divisions gained permanence. What had once been flexible identities became rigid categories enforced by both church and state. The creation of these divisions was not accidental. It made it easier to govern, control, and exploit. Missionaries also introduced new forms of dependency. Communities that once relied on their own healing systems, spiritual leaders, and social networks became reliant on missionary institutions. Hospitals run by missions often came with restrictions on traditional healing practices. Schools discouraged local art and music. Churches taught that ancestral traditions were demonic. Over time, entire communities lost their self-sufficiency. When the missionaries eventually withdrew, many societies found themselves without the cultural tools that had once sustained them. The psychological consequences of missionary work are rarely discussed, but deeply significant. By teaching people that their ancestors were living in error, missionaries created generational self-hatred. Children raised to view their traditions as sinful, learned to see their heritage as a burden rather than a source of pride. This internalized shame often carried into adulthood, shaping how communities valued themselves. The long-term result was not only cultural loss, but also diminished confidence in building societies based on their own traditions. In parts of Africa and Asia, missionaries became influential intermediaries between colonial governments and local populations. They often advised colonial officials, shaped legal codes, and influenced policies. By aligning spiritual authority with political authority, they made colonial power seem inevitable. People learned to associate obedience to the state with obedience to God. This blurred line between religion and politics created a framework where resistance was framed not only as rebellion against rulers, but as rebellion against divine will. In India, missionaries were among the strongest advocates for aligning social practices with Christian moral codes. They lobbied against certain local customs, portraying them as barbaric. While some reforms are celebrated today, the way they were carried out undermined the ability of Indian society to reform itself from within. Instead of empowering local thinkers to guide change, missionaries imposed external standards. This created a narrative that progress could only come from adopting Western Christian norms. The idea that indigenous societies were incapable of self-improvement was reinforced, leaving behind an inferiority complex that is still visible. Even when missionaries were not directly violent, their presence often paved the way for violence. By undermining existing belief systems, they weakened the spiritual resilience of societies. When colonizers arrived with armies, the groundwork had already been laid. Communities whose traditions had been eroded were less able to unify in resistance. The missionary was often the first wave, softening the soil for conquest. The sword followed the cross, but the cross prepared the ground another. Overlooked aspect is how missionaries disrupted ecological knowledge. Indigenous communities often had complex systems of managing land, farming, and medicine that were deeply tied to their spiritual beliefs. Missionaries dismissed these as superstition. Sacred groves were cut down, rituals tied to seasonal cycles were abandoned, and traditional medicine was replaced with Western approaches. This was not just cultural destruction, but environmental damage. By breaking the spiritual connection to the land, missionaries contributed to ecological imbalance that continues to this day. The modern missionary movement, though less openly tied to colonial empires, still carries echoes of the past. Many missionary organizations today operate as NGOs, presenting themselves as humanitarian. They bring food, education, and healthcare, but their underlying goal remains conversion. In disaster zones, Missionary groups are often among the first to arrive, but aid is not always unconditional. There are documented cases where assistance is tied to participation in religious activities. Vulnerable people in crisis are asked to choose between survival and maintaining their beliefs. This practice is not limited to poor countries. Even within wealthy nations, missionary programs target vulnerable populations: immigrants, the homeless, and marginalized communities. What looks like charity is often accompanied by the expectation of conversion. Soup kitchens serve food alongside sermons. Rehabilitation programs for addiction come with mandatory religious components. Aid becomes entangled with evangelism, continuing the tradition of using dependency to spread faith. The persistence of missionary activity today raises questions about cultural respect. In a world that claims to value diversity, missionary work often still assumes that one religion is the universal answer. The arrogance of assuming that entire civilizations need to be saved continues, even when history shows the damage such projects have caused. Instead of learning from the past, missionary organizations continue to operate with the same conviction, repeating old patterns under modern branding. The financial dimension of modern missionary work is also telling. Billions of dollars are spent annually on evangelism, much of it directed toward countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This is not money used simply to feed the hungry or build infrastructure. It is money used to sustain a global project of conversion. Wealthy donors in developed nations fund campaigns that reshape the spiritual landscape of poorer nations, maintaining a global imbalance where belief systems flow in one direction, from the powerful to the powerless. What makes missionary history particularly striking is how little of this is openly acknowledged. In public memory, missionaries are often celebrated as brave travelers and educators. Statues, plaques, and church histories portray them as heroes. Rarely are they remembered as agents of cultural destruction. Rarely is the trauma they inflicted given recognition. The people whose identities were fractured by missionary work are seldom the ones writing the official histories. This silence is itself a continuation of the erasure. The dark history of missionary work is not about isolated incidents. It is a systemic pattern. Wherever missionaries went, they carried the assumption of superiority. Their work aligned with political and economic domination. They used education, medicine, and charity as tools. But the underlying goal was always to replace one worldview with another. The consequence was not only the spread of Christianity, but the diminishment of human diversity, the loss of countless traditions, and the internalization of inferiority by entire societies. In recent decades, missionary organizations have become powerful political players. They no longer simply travel to remote villages with Bibles. They run large networks with vast funding. Some of these organizations influence the laws of entire countries. In parts of Africa, for example, American evangelical missionary groups have lobbied for laws that criminalize homosexuality. They frame their activism as moral guidance, but the result is often persecution. What was once cultural erasure has expanded into legal and political control, shaping societies according to a foreign moral code. The same pattern is seen in debates about reproductive rights. Missionary-funded organizations frequently campaign against access to contraception and abortion in developing countries. They do this under the banner of protecting life, but the effect is to restrict women's autonomy. Communities struggling with overpopulation, poverty, and high maternal mortality rates are pushed toward policies that make their problems worse. Instead of allowing local populations to decide what is best for themselves, missionaries impose restrictions rooted in doctrine. This is not simply religious influence. It is a continuation of colonial control by other means. One striking example is Uganda, where foreign missionaries have shaped national politics for decades. Evangelical groups from the United States have funded schools, churches, and aid projects, but they have also supported policies that limit human rights. In 2009, the infamous anti-homosexuality bill was strongly backed by American missionary organizations. The bill proposed extreme penalties, including death in some versions, for same-sex relationships. Although international backlash forced some revisions, the fact that foreign missionaries could have such influence over a nation's laws shows how deeply these networks operate. In Papua New Guinea, missionaries continue to push against indigenous traditions by labeling them demonic. Even though many communities have formally converted, cultural practices such as spirit rituals, healing ceremonies, and traditional dances are still targeted. Instead of coexisting with local customs, missionaries encourage communities to abandon them completely. This creates a cycle of cultural alienation, where people are left feeling trapped between an inherited faith and a suppressed identity. The supposed gift of salvation has, in practice, produced division and confusion. Modern missionary work also has a digital dimension. With the rise of technology, missionary organizations use radio, television, and online platforms to reach audiences across the globe. Programs broadcast into remote areas present Christianity as modern, rational, and progressive, while portraying local traditions as outdated. The medium has changed, but the message is the same. Abandon your heritage. Adopt ours. Even humanitarian appeals are wrapped in religious messaging, ensuring that conversion remains central to every interaction. One overlooked effect of missionary influence is how it undermines secular development. When resources are channeled through religious organizations, aid is distributed according to religious priorities rather than community needs. A village may need agricultural support, but instead it receives a church and a school focused on Scripture. A clinic may be built, but contraception is forbidden. The shaping of development through missionary values often leaves communities without tools they actually need. What appears as generosity is, in fact, control over the direction of social progress. There are also ethical concerns about how missionaries handle emergencies. After natural disasters, missionary groups are often quick to arrive with supplies. But aid is sometimes tied to participation in religious activities. Survivors of earthquakes, hurricanes, or floods may find that food is distributed at a church service, or that housing support comes with a sermon. The urgency of survival makes refusal difficult. Faith becomes entangled with basic human needs in ways that exploit vulnerability. Some defenders of missionary work argue that it has brought education and healthcare to places that lacked them. This is true in part, but the cost was never neutral. Education often came at the price of cultural destruction. Healthcare came with strings attached, such as the rejection of local medicine or prohibitions against reproductive services. The benefits were framed as gifts, but they were also tools of reshaping identity. When you look at the full picture, what was gained cannot be measured without recognizing what was lost. Another aspect worth examining is how missionaries fuel dependency on foreign funding. Communities become reliant on external donations rather than building self-sustaining systems. Missionary schools and hospitals often operate on money raised abroad, which means they answer to foreign donors rather than local people. This dynamic keeps power flowing in one direction. Even when communities gain access to services, they remain tethered to outside control. Independence is traded for dependency, and autonomy is quietly eroded. In some parts of the world, communities have begun to resist missionary influence. Indigenous movements in Latin America, for instance, have revived ancient traditions and languages that were suppressed by missionaries. They recognize that reclaiming cultural identity is a form of healing. In Australia, efforts to preserve Aboriginal spirituality have grown stronger in response to the legacy of missions. In North America, Native communities are revitalizing their languages and ceremonies, often in defiance of the missionary history that tried to erase them. These acts of resistance highlight the resilience of human diversity, but they also reveal the scale of the damage that had to be overcome. The dark legacy of missionary work is not just historical. It is ongoing. Missionaries continue to frame their work as love and service, but the underlying assumption has not changed. One belief system must replace all others. This is the arrogance that defined the colonial era, and it persists under the language of humanitarianism. The tragedy is that people around the world are still told that their own ways of life are inadequate, even though those ways sustained them for generations. The real measure of missionary history is not the number of churches built or Bibles distributed. It is the number of languages lost, the traditions abandoned, the identities fractured. It is the psychological scars carried by communities told that their ancestors lived in darkness. It is the ongoing struggles of nations where foreign religious influence still shapes politics and society. When you add up these costs, the story of missionary work is not one of salvation, but of erasure. The narrative of charity and compassion hides a darker truth. Missionary work, whether in the past or today, often operates less as a gift and more as a strategy of control. It presents itself as selfless, but it perpetuates dependency, undermines cultural confidence, and distorts development. When people are told that their survival depends on abandoning their heritage, the outcome is not progress. It is loss. The dark history of missionaries is not a chapter we can close. It is a pattern that continues, reshaped but unbroken, still influencing the lives of millions. One of the most important questions to ask is why this history still matters today. Many people assume that missionary work is a relic of the past, tied only to colonial times. But the truth is that the structures built by missionaries continue to shape global dynamics. The schools and churches they left behind still influence education and politics. The divisions they created within communities still generate conflict. The idea that one worldview must dominate continues to echo in international development, foreign policy, and cultural exchange. Consider how missionary work shaped language itself. In many parts of Africa and the Pacific, literacy was introduced through the Bible. On the surface, this seems like empowerment. But it meant that the first written texts in many languages were not local stories, histories, or philosophies. They were scripture. Entire generations learned to associate reading and writing with Christianity. This cemented the idea that knowledge came from outside, not from within. By controlling the gateway to literacy, missionaries controlled the way people thought about truth. The psychological framework built by missionary work also left deep marks. People taught that their ancestors lived in error, often internalized the idea that progress comes only from abandoning tradition. This mindset shapes how communities relate to modern challenges. Instead of trusting their own heritage for solutions, they are conditioned to look outward. This pattern benefits the same powers that once colonized them because it maintains dependency. Missionary work, in this sense, was not just about converting individuals. It was about creating societies that defer to outside authority. The global imbalance of power is reinforced by missionary networks today. Wealth flows from the global north to the south, but it comes with ideological strings. American and European churches raise billions for missions each year. That money builds churches, funds schools, and supports pastors in other countries. On paper, it looks like charity. In practice, it ensures that poorer nations remain shaped by the worldview of wealthier ones. The same imbalance that defined colonial empires continues, disguised as generosity. It is also worth noting that missionary work shaped how religion itself is understood globally. By presenting Christianity as universal, missionaries created a model where religions are judged by their ability to spread. The success of a belief system is measured in numbers of converts, not in the depth of its wisdom or the harmony it creates. This competitive framework turns faith into a kind of market, where religions fight for followers as corporations fight for customers. Missionaries pioneered this global competition, and the result is a world where spiritual traditions are often valued only by how aggressively they expand. The dark legacy also plays out in how Christianity spread alongside ideas of racial superiority. Missionaries may not always have openly preached racism, but their work often reinforced it. By dismissing indigenous cultures as primitive, they implied that European identity was closer to God. Converts were encouraged to mimic European manners, dress, and behavior as signs of holiness. Over time, this reinforced a hierarchy that equated whiteness with civilization and goodness. These patterns did not end when colonialism officially ended. They remain embedded in global perceptions of race and culture. Another overlooked impact is how missionary work disrupted intergenerational knowledge. Traditional societies passed wisdom through oral storytelling, rituals, and ceremonies. Missionaries disrupted these systems by labeling them sinful and replacing them with Sunday schools, catechism, and Bible study. The result was a break in transmission. Elders lost their role as knowledge keepers, and young people were encouraged to see them as obstacles to progress. This weakened social cohesion and left communities vulnerable to external manipulation. Even today, missionaries often claim to defend the poor. But by teaching the poor that their suffering is meaningful, they discourage resistance to the conditions that cause poverty. In many sermons preached in the developing world, poverty is described as a spiritual trial. The promise is that those who endure will be rewarded in heaven. This shifts attention away from systemic injustice and keeps people focused on personal salvation. The missionary message has always been most effective when it convinces the oppressed to accept their oppression. The question then becomes, what would the world look like without missionary interference? Many societies would likely have modernized in their own way, blending traditions with new ideas at their own pace. Cultural change is natural, but the violent acceleration and forced direction imposed by missionaries caused unnecessary harm. By assuming that entire civilizations needed saving, missionaries denied them the chance to evolve on their own terms. The loss is not only historical, it is also the loss of what could have been. This is why remembering the dark history of missionary work is so important. It challenges the sanitized version of history taught in schools and churches. It forces us to recognize that what was called charity often came with coercion. It reminds us that behind every smiling missionary photograph, there may be stories of children beaten for speaking their language, of traditions erased, of identities broken. This is not an attack on individuals who believed they were helping. It is an acknowledgement that the system they were part of caused deep and lasting harm. When you add it all together, the story becomes clear. Missionary work was never just about spreading faith. It was about shaping societies to align with foreign powers. It was about controlling knowledge, rewriting identities, and securing obedience. The infrastructure of schools and hospitals may remain, but the invisible scars are just as enduring. The price of salvation was the loss of self-determination. Recognizing this history does not mean denying that some missionaries were sincere or kind. It means refusing to ignore the larger structure they served. Individuals may have believed they were doing good, but the system was designed for domination. By facing this truth, we can begin to understand how deeply missionary work has shaped the world we live in today. And only by recognizing it can societies reclaim what was taken from them: languages, traditions, autonomy, and pride in their own heritage. When people today look back at the age of missions, they often see only the surface: schools, hospitals, and churches. They see photographs of missionaries holding children, teaching in classrooms, or standing proudly in front of small chapels. What they don't see are the invisible costs. They don't see the child who was punished for speaking her native language. They don't see the elder whose wisdom was dismissed as superstition. They don't see the communities that fractured under the weight of imposed beliefs. History remembers the buildings, but forgets the broken bonds that came with them. Missionary work was presented as love, but it often operated as a form of conquest. It replaced traditions with dependency. It silenced languages and rewrote histories. It reshaped gender roles, moral codes, and cultural values to fit a foreign model. Even when it claimed to offer education and healthcare, it came with strings attached, strings that tied entire societies to outside authority. What seemed like progress was often disempowerment in disguise. The story matters because its effects are still unfolding. The identities shaped by missionary work continue to influence how people see themselves today. The divisions created by missionaries continue to fuel conflicts. The dependency built through missionary aid continues to keep poorer nations tied to wealthier ones. Even the idea that one religion has the right to reshape the world continues in modern forms of evangelism, development work, and global politics. Missionary work may no longer carry the open violence of colonial times, but its legacy is alive in quieter, more subtle forms. Acknowledging this history does not mean denying that individuals sometimes acted with compassion. It means recognizing that compassion was harnessed to a larger system of control. Missionaries may have believed they were saving souls, but the institutions they built were part of an apparatus that reshaped societies in the image of those who held power. To understand the present, we must understand that missionary work was never separate from politics, economics, and empire. It was one of the pillars that held colonialism together. The most profound loss caused by missionary activity was not material, but existential. Entire communities were taught to doubt themselves. They were told that their ancestors lived in darkness, that their songs were meaningless, that their gods were false, and that their ways of life were empty. Once that belief took root, it hollowed out cultural pride and replaced it with dependence on outside validation. This is the deepest wound of missionary work. The teaching that people could only find dignity by abandoning who they were. The resistance we see today, movements to revive indigenous languages, to celebrate suppressed traditions, to reclaim old philosophies, is a response to that wound. It shows that despite everything, the human spirit fights for self-definition. Communities are working to recover what was lost, even if it cannot be fully restored. The fact that these movements exist is a testament to resilience, but it is also a reminder of the scale of destruction they are resisting. The dark history of Christian missionary work is not a footnote. It is a central part of how the modern world was built. It explains why so many societies carry scars of cultural loss. It explains why global power remains tilted in the direction of those who once sent missionaries abroad. And it explains why, even today, the language of love and service can be used to disguise domination. What history demands of us is honesty. To look at missionary work not as a tale of sacrifice, but as a story of control. To see that behind every school built, a tradition may have been dismantled. Behind every Bible distributed, a language may have been silenced. Behind every smiling missionary portrait, there may have been a child who learned to see their own culture as worthless. This is the story that rarely makes it into official histories, but it is the story that matters. Because only when we tell it fully can we understand the cost of missionary work. Only then can we honor the traditions that were suppressed, the languages that were lost, and the people who resisted. The real measure of progress is not how many converts were made or how many churches were built. It is how much human dignity was preserved. Missionary work claimed to save souls, but in the process, it erased identities. It promised light but left behind shadows. Its legacy is not only in the spread of Christianity, but in the silence of forgotten voices. To recognize this is not bitterness. It is truth. and truth is the first step toward restoring the dignity of those whose lives were reshaped by a project that claimed to bring salvation, but instead brought loss.